You ever hear that saying, too poor to be green?
Yeah.
It's a common one,
Right.
but get ready to rethink everything you thought you knew about India development and the environment, because today we're diving deep into this idea of whether India really is at an environmental crossroads.
Okay.
We'll be exploring this super complex relationship between economic growth and sustainability in India. We're going way beyond the headlines to see if it's really a choice between progress and a healthy planet.
Interesting.
We're going to be using India's environmental crossroads, development, sustainability, and the future to help us guide this deep dive.
Okay.
Get ready for some surprising facts, myth busting, and who knows, maybe even a little dose of hope for the future.
It's interesting how often the story around developing nations pits economic growth against environmental protection.
Yeah.
This idea that you can only have one or the other, a thriving economy or a healthy environment.
It's like they can't exist together.
Yes, exactly. That's where this too poor to be green argument comes in. But what we're seeing in our research is that this take is not only way oversimplified, but also pretty dangerous.
Okay, let's break this down. Back in 1994, the historian Eric Hobsbawm said that environmentalism is basically a luxury of the rich and middle class. He argued that if you're poor, you're more worried about immediate needs like jobs and food than saving the rainforest. I can see his point, but do you really think that's true in India's case?
That's definitely a common perspective.
Yeah.
But if we look at the history of environmental activism in India, it falls apart pretty quickly.
Yeah.
There are so many examples of people fighting for environmental protection because it directly impacts their lives.
Yeah, the Chipko movement comes to mind. Back in the 1970s, you had villagers in the Himalayas literally hugging trees to prevent deforestation. What's really powerful about this is that these people relied completely on those forests.
The Chipko movement is so important because it shows just how much environmental protection and economic well-being are connected, especially in marginalized communities.
Right.
For these villagers, the forest was everything. It was their livelihood, their source of food, fuel, and water.
It was their life.
Losing it wasn't some abstract idea. It would have destroyed their entire way of life.
It seems that India has a history of grassroots environmental activism that ties back to economic needs. It's fascinating how the ecologist Madhav Gadgil found that poorer communities in India are often more concerned about sustainability than the elite. I mean, that completely flips the rich people's problem argument on its head.
Absolutely. And Gadgil pointed out that it's because the poor are the ones living on the front lines of environmental damage. They're the first to feel the effects of pollution, deforestation, and climate change.
Okay, so we've debunked this myth that India is too poor to be green. But then what should India's development path look like? Some people say they should just follow the West's industrialization model. Do you think that would work?
You're talking about the idea that India should basically retrace the steps of Europe and North America.
Yeah.
While that might sound simple, our research shows that this approach is fundamentally flawed. The reality is that India is dealing with an entirely different set of circumstances.
You're right. India is not a copy of the West. They have a much larger population to support, which puts a lot of pressure on their resources. Plus, India's ecosystems are more fragile and can't really handle heavy industrialization. And let's not forget the historical legacy of resource depletion, thanks in part to colonial exploitation.
Trying to force-fit India into the Western model of development is not only unsustainable, but potentially catastrophic.
Yeah.
Simply can't ignore the context. It's like trying to cram a Tata Nano engine into a Ferrari.
Right.
It's just not going to work. What India needs is a development path that takes all of this into account and prioritizes sustainable practices.
So then the big question is, can India develop without destroying its environment? It seems like that's the conversation we should be having, right?
Absolutely. There's so many crucial questions that need to be addressed, like how can we empower local communities to manage their own forests? And how can we make sure people displaced by large development projects get meaningful support and not just cash settlements?
Those are great points. How can we make urbanization more sustainable and ensure it doesn't completely drain resources from rural areas? And can we create a more inclusive approach to wildlife conservation that protects entire ecosystems instead of just a few popular species?
If these questions aren't addressed, the environment is going to get left off the menu entirely.
You're right. If you aren't at the table, you're on the menu. I think it's interesting that when we talk about India's environment, climate change seems to be the only issue that really gets any attention. What do you think about that?
You're right. And it's often framed in terms of the West's hypocrisy. The argument is usually, why should India cut emissions when the West has been polluting for centuries?
I can see both sides. I mean, on one hand, the West demanding developing nations switch to green energy without providing financial and technological assistance is a form of climate colonialism, which doesn't seem fair at all. But I also see how focusing on the West's responsibility could overshadow the very real environmental problems happening in India right now.
Exactly. It's important to acknowledge that the climate change issue is intertwined with global power dynamics and historical inequalities.
Mm.
But we can't let that distract us from the urgent environmental challenges India is facing independently of climate change.
And there are so many, I mean, just look at Delhi. It has some of the worst air pollution in the entire world. Plus, most of the rivers in India are considered biologically dead because they're so polluted. And then there's the groundwater depletion reaching crisis levels even in agricultural areas like Punjab. Mhm. Not to mention all the chemical fertilizers poisoning farmland and food and the invasive species taking over the forests. It just seems like one thing after another.
And none of these crises are primarily the result of climate change. They stem from bad governance, corruption, and an emphasis on short-term economic gains. Sadly, it seems like long-term environmental sustainability is rarely considered.
Hmm.
And this is where the issue of inequality in India becomes really important to consider.
Because when the environment gets damaged, it's not like everyone is impacted the same way.
That's right.
Right.
Our research highlights that the burden of environmental damage falls disproportionately on the poorest and most vulnerable people in India.
So they are more likely to live in areas that are already environmentally stressed, and they also have fewer resources to cope with any problems.
Exactly. Think about it. Who suffers the most when water sources are polluted? Who loses their livelihood when forests are degraded? It's not the wealthy elite.
It's definitely not. They can afford to protect themselves, they can buy bottled water, live in gated communities, and even invest in things like air purifiers and those high-tech pollution masks. Unfortunately, the poor are left to deal with the worst of it.
And this brings us to another troubling point, the sidelining of experts.
India has a ton of brilliant environmental scientists, researchers, and activists, right?
Absolutely. What's frustrating is that India actually has a lot of knowledge and expertise when it comes to environmental issues. But those voices are often ignored.
That doesn't make sense. If
Yeah.
they have people who know how to solve these problems, why aren't those solutions being implemented?
Well, if you look at the political landscape, it's clear that short-term economic interests are usually prioritized over long-term environmental concerns.
It sounds like politicians are focused on policies that promise quick growth, even if it means sacrificing the environment.
And those politicians are often beholden to corporate donors with interest in heavily polluting industries.
So you end up with a system where the pursuit of economic growth benefits a select few, while the environment and vulnerable populations pay the price.
Exactly. GDP growth is prioritized over the health of ecosystems and the well-being of people. What's interesting is that this isn't a left-wing versus right-wing issue.
Yeah, I was surprised to learn that all of the political parties in India have consistently prioritized development over sustainability.
It's a systemic problem across the board. It can be pretty disheartening.
It does make you wonder if there's any hope for change. Are we just going to keep making the same mistakes?
Well, there is a glimmer of hope, and it's coming from the younger generation.
Gen Z and millennials.
That's right. They seem to be more aware of environmental issues and less willing to accept the idea that it's either environment or development. They're demanding a more holistic approach.
That's encouraging. It reminds me of the Chipko movement. Nobody thought a group of villagers hugging trees could spark a massive movement, but it did.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Change can come from unexpected places, and it often starts from the ground up.
So maybe we'll see history repeat itself with this generation leading the way. They seem to be more passionate and they have technology on their side. Plus, they understand how everything is connected.
It's a powerful thought. And it brings us to an important question for you, the listener. What role can you play in shaping a more sustainable future for India?
It can feel overwhelming to even think about these challenges. It's like, what can one person really do?
You're right. These are complex systemic problems, but individual action is still important. We can all do our part by getting educated, raising awareness, and holding our leaders accountable.
So instead of accepting this too poor to be green narrative, we need to challenge it and demand better policies. Plus, we can support sustainable practices and amplify the voices of people working towards a better balance.
Remember, saying too poor to be green is often just another way of saying too lazy to care, and we can't afford to be lazy about this.
What do you think it would mean for the rest of the world if India could figure out how to balance development and sustainability and break free from this outdated way of thinking? Could they set an example for other developing nations?
That's a great question. India has a huge population,
Uh,
incredible biodiversity, and big economic goals. They're at a turning point.
it feels like the whole world is watching to see what happens in India.
The stakes are high. If India can show that it's possible to achieve sustainable development and lift millions out of poverty without destroying the environment, it could have a global impact.
Other countries might start to rethink their own approaches and break free from outdated models.
Exactly. India could be a beacon of hope for the future, demonstrating that economic progress and environmental stewardship can work together.
It sounds like our listeners should be careful not to buy into those simplistic narratives. Don't believe the too poor to be green rhetoric.
Right. Challenge it, question it, dig deeper. Because the reality in India is far more nuanced and complex.
And ultimately hopeful. It really feels like the future is being written right now in India, and
Yeah.
it's not set in stone.
That's a great way to put it. The future is something we create through our choices and actions, and by speaking up and demanding better.
So it sounds like the main takeaway for our listeners is to stay informed and engaged. Don't just accept those simple explanations. Look deeper, question things, and be a part of the change.
Exactly. What we've seen today is that India's situation is far more complex and nuanced than those simple headlines. But there's definitely hope.
There is. And the potential for real change is definitely there. Who knows, maybe India will shock everyone and show the world what a truly sustainable future can look like.
It's a future worth striving for. A future where people and the planet can thrive together.
Well, that's it for our deep dive this week. We hope you found it thought-provoking and maybe even a little inspiring.
Remember, knowledge is power, but it's only valuable if we actually use it to make the world a better place.
So let's all commit to learning more, having those tough conversations, and demanding better from our leaders. Let's build a future where too poor to be green is a thing of the past.
Thanks for joining us. Until next time.